Part 2. The Canvas Killer's Legacy. The city had returned to an unsettling calm after John Larson's execution. To most, it seemed that justice had been served. The killings had stopped. The infamous phoenix symbol tied to Larson, a talented but misunderstood artist, had been erased. But for Detective Elijah Quinn, the case was far from over. His gut told him there was something more, something lurking just beneath the surface. The tiny, nearly invisible scratch on Gregory Miller's wrist still haunted Quinn. It wasn't the kind of thing you missed unless you weren't looking for it, and Quinn always looked deeper. His instincts told him that this wasn't over, that John Larson wasn't the killer the world thought he was. Someone had framed Larson. Someone smart, patient, and incredibly meticulous. As Quinn sat in his dimly lit office, the city outside the window bathed in the last rays of sunlight, he began reviewing the evidence again. The autopsy reports from other victims of the supposed Phoenix killings caught his eye. There it was, on a victim named Susan Grant. Another barely noticeable mark, the same as on Miller's wrist. A faint scratch hidden under the phoenix, shaped like the tail of a snake. Quinn's mind raced. The killer wasn't finished. He was just getting started. And this wasn't about John Larson at all. Marcus Holloway's plan had been unfolding perfectly. John Larson had taken the fall for his crimes just as Marcus had intended. But it was never about framing Larson forever. No, Larson was merely the opening act in what would become Marcus's true masterpiece. His killings were part of a larger design, a pattern that no one, not even Quinn, could see. Yet. Marcus sat in the quiet of his apartment, sketching out his next moves. He had already chosen his next victim, Claudia Price, the director of the prestigious Larson Gallery, where John had once exhibited his work. She had been a staunch defender of John, vocal in her belief that he was innocent. Her death would send a message, not just to the police but to anyone who had doubted John's guilt. But Marcus wasn't just killing for the sake of it. Each death, each symbol he left behind was a brushstroke on a much larger canvas, a grand design that no one would understand until the final piece was in place. The night of Claudia's murder, Marcus followed her as she left the gallery after a long day of meetings. She didn't notice him trailing her through the city's winding streets, lost in her own thoughts. When she stopped by a small park near the edge of the art district, Marcus saw his chance. He moved quickly, stepping out of the shadows, syringe in hand. Claudia barely had time to react before Marcus injected her with a paralytic. She slumped to the ground, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to cry out, but no sound came. Marcus knelt beside her, his hands steady as he began to work. First, the phoenix, just like before, etched into her chest, bold and unmistakable. And then, for Quinn, a subtle touch of his own, a snake's head, this time etched into her wrist, its eyes barely visible in the dim streetlight. As the life drained from Claudia's body, Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow and took a step back, admiring his work. The snake and the phoenix together, an image Quinn would undoubtedly notice. He knew the detective was smart enough to start seeing the pattern soon. That was the point. The following morning, Quinn stood over Claudia's body, the familiar weight of dread settling into his chest. Another victim, another phoenix. But Quinn wasn't focused on the symbol that had already led to one man's death. He was focused on the tiny mark on Claudia's wrist, the unmistakable sign of the same killer who had left his trace on Gregory Miller. This wasn't Larson's work. The real killer was still out there, and now Quinn had to convince his colleagues that the case was far from closed. In the weeks that followed, more bodies turned up. Each one had a connection to the art world, and each one bore the same phoenix symbol, sometimes more elaborate, sometimes simpler, but always present. Yet, Quinn noticed the other detail that no one else seemed to see: the snake. A curator at a downtown gallery was found dead in her home, her body laid out beneath one of John Larson's lesser-known pieces. A snake's coiled tail was etched faintly into her ankle. A local art critic who had once written a scathing review of Larson's work was discovered near the waterfront, with the snake's head hidden under the phoenix on his shoulder. The city was in a state of panic. The public and police alike thought that perhaps a copycat killer was at large, but Quinn knew better. This wasn't a copycat. This was the original artist, Marcus Holloway. Quinn sat in his office late one night. Maps of the city spread out before him, each marked with the location of the recent killings. Something was forming in his mind, a pattern, but he couldn't quite piece it together. He studied the maps, considering the placement of each body and the significance of each mark the killer left. The location of each body roughly corresponded to the parts of the snake etched into the victims. The tail, the coils, the head, the bodies mapped out across the city were forming the snake's body. But why? As he stared at the map, something else dawned on him. The bodies weren't placed randomly. They created lines that mimicked the image of a snake wrapping around something. Quinn grabbed a marker and began tracing the points. His pulse quickened as he saw it. A snake, coiled around a dagger, stretching across the entire city. Each killing was part of a larger design, and Marcus was painting it with blood. But one thing still nagged at him. What was the dagger? He knew that whatever was at the heart of this snake was crucial. Marcus watched from afar, knowing that Quinn was getting closer. The detective was smart, probably the smartest he had ever played against. But it didn't matter. Marcus had planned for this, every step leading Quinn deeper into his trap. The next victim had already been chosen: Jeremy Klein, a former friend and collaborator of John Larson. Klein had distanced himself from John after the trial, but his ties to Larson's work were undeniable. Marcus had followed him for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. One night, as Klein left a small art exhibit downtown, Marcus struck. The murder was swift, clean, and brutal. Marcus carved both the phoenix and his now signature snake into Klein's chest, leaving the body in an alley not far from the gallery where Larson's work had once been displayed. But this time, Marcus left something else, something more personal. He placed a small blood-stained sketch of a snake coiled around a dagger in Klein's hand. It was a symbol that Quinn would recognize instantly. When Quinn arrived at the scene, his heart sank. Another killing, and this time the message was clear. He knelt beside Klein's body, pulling the sketch from the victim's hand. The snake coiled around the dagger. It was unmistakable. The killer was sending him a direct message, taunting him. Quinn stared at the sketch in his hand. The snake around the dagger. It wasn't just about the bodies anymore. It was about him. The killer wanted him to see the bigger picture, the city-wide canvas. But why the dagger? He looked back at the map, his fingers tracing the snake's path. The dagger wasn't just a symbol, it was pointing to a location, a central spot in the city that had yet to see a murder. The snake was coiled around it, and at the dagger's tip there was a space still unmarked. Then, one evening, a letter arrived at Quinn's office. Handwritten, addressed directly to him. He opened it carefully, his heart pounding as he read the single line scrawled across the paper. The canvas is ready for its final stroke. Enclosed was a photograph of another victim. A young woman, her body laid out with the snake and dagger boldly carved into her chest. But there was no phoenix this time, no hint of Larson's signature. Quinn's stomach twisted. The killer wasn't just framing artists anymore, he was framing him. Quinn pored over the map again, desperately trying to figure it out, the victims, the symbols, the locations. The snake had encircled the entire city, with each victim marking a point on its body, and now, with this final clue, it was clear the dagger was pointing to him. The points on the map told the story. A city-wide symbol, a snake and dagger, with the final strike yet to come. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just the investigator, he was the final victim. Marcus had been setting Quinn up for the final stroke all along. The detective wasn't just the hunter. He was the final mark on the canvas, and the canvas was the city itself.